The sound of his wedding ring hitting the granite countertop shouldn't have been that loud, but in the sterile silence of our kitchen, it rang out like a gunshot. It was a casual, practiced motion, a flick of the wrist as he prepared to wash his hands, though I knew he wouldn't put it back on until he pulled into our driveway 10 hours later. That was the moment of impact for me today, the realization that the man I had shared a bed with for 20 years no longer even felt the need to hide the click of the metal against the stone. He didn't look at me as he did it. He didn't look at me as he dried his hands on the linen towel I had hand-picked to match the backsplash he had insisted we couldn't afford. To Mark, I had become part of the architecture of the house, functional, silent, and entirely overlooked. I was the baseboard he walked past, the window he looked through to see if the weather suited his suit. I stood by the island, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. I watched him in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator, a ghost observing a man who believed he was the only living soul in the room. He was 52, but he spent 45 minutes every morning trying to convince the mirror he was 35. He adjusted his silk tie, a deep, predatory red with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He tucked a stray hair into place, his eyes narrowed in appraisal of his own jawline. He was a man preparing for a conquest, his chest puffed out, his shoulders squared. He looked every bit the high-powered executive he pretended to be, fueled by a vanity that had grown like a weed in the cracks of our crumbling intimacy. "Did you remember the dry cleaning?" He asked, his voice flat, directed at the toaster rather than at me. He didn't wait for an answer. He was already scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving with a frantic, hungry energy. A small, tight smile flickered across his lips, the kind of smile he used to give me when we were 24 and living in a walk-up with nothing but a mattress and a dream. Now that smile was reserved for a screen, for a woman whose name I already knew but hadn't yet spoken aloud. I could feel the heat of his betrayal radiating off him, a physical thing that made the air in the kitchen feel heavy and hard to breathe. He had no idea that while he was checking his reflection, I was checking my margins. He had no idea that the book club I attended every Tuesday night was actually a board meeting for Vance Capital, the investment firm I had built from the ground up using my maiden name. To the world of high finance, Alina Vance was a shadow, a titan who moved millions with a single email. To Mark, I was just Elle, the woman who forgot to buy the organic eggs and who probably didn't understand how his 401k worked. The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed every morning with my tea. I had spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring the holding company that owned his firm. I had watched from the periphery as he grew more arrogant, more dismissive, more certain of his own brilliance, even as I signed the papers that would eventually put his entire career in the palm of my hand. He finally looked at me, but his gaze didn't linger. It swept over my faded robe and my unbrushed hair with a flicker of something that looked dangerously like pity. "I'll be late tonight," he said, grabbing his briefcase. "Big merger meeting. The new CEO is coming in from the parent company." Everyone's on edge. I leaned against the counter, feeling the cold stone through my robe. "I'm sure you'll make a great impression, Mark," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the hurt I had felt a year ago. "I always do," he replied, his hand on the door handle. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't even say see you later. He just stepped out into the bright morning sun, leaving me in the shadows of the house I had paid for with money he didn't know I had. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, the engine purring with a luxury he thought he earned. I took a slow sip of my cold tea and looked at the wedding ring he'd left sitting on the counter. In 3 hours, I would be sitting at the head of a mahogany table in a glass-walled boardroom, and for the first time in 20 years, Mark was going to have to look me in the eye and see exactly who I was. The afternoon had been a whirlwind of silent power, a symphony of signatures and sharp, decisive nods in a boardroom 30 floors above the city's noise. I had sat at the head of that mahogany table, the air conditioning humming a low, expensive tune, while the men who had spent years ignoring my existence suddenly scrambled to offer me water, coffee, and their unyielding loyalty. But as the sun began to dip behind the skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the glass, I transitioned back. I stepped out of the tailored power suit and back into the role of Alina, the woman who lived in the peripheral vision of a man named Mark. Mark returned to the house at 5, the front door slamming with a violence that spoke of a man who believed the world was finally bending to his will. He didn't come to find me. He stood in the hallway, shouting up the stairs as if I were a servant he was summoning for a task. El, get ready. We're going to El Espoir at 8. I've already made the reservation. El Espoir, the name itself felt like a taunt. It was the kind of place where the tasting menu cost more than our first car, a cathedral of white linen and whispered ambitions. I walked to the top of the landing, looking down at him. He was still in his work suit, but he had loosened his tie, his face flushed with a cocktail of adrenaline and ego. He looked up, his eyes skimming over me with that familiar, clinical detachment. "Is this about the merger?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "It's about my future," he snapped, turning toward the mirror to inspect a non-existent blemish on his cheek. The new CEO was at the office today. I didn't get a direct meeting. The board kept her sequestered, but the word is she's looking to trim the fat and promote the real talent. Tonight is about positioning. I've invited a few key people to join us for drinks afterward. I need you to look appropriate. I followed him into our bedroom, the sanctuary I had decorated with soft silks and warm lighting, though tonight it felt like a staging ground for a battle he didn't know he was losing. I moved toward the closet, my hand instinctively reaching for a sleek, floor-length gown in charcoal silk, a dress that cost $3,000 and made me look like the woman I actually was. "No," Mark said, his voice sharp behind me. He walked over and pushed the silk aside, his fingers rummaging through the back of the rack until he pulled out a dress I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. It was a wrap dress in a faded, dusty rose floral pattern, the fabric slightly pilled at the seams, the cut hopelessly dated. "Wear this one." I looked at the dress, then at him. "Mark, that's from the year we moved in here. It's practically a relic." "It's modest," he countered, his eyes narrowing. "It says you're a supportive wife who doesn't spend her husband's hard-earned money on frivolous things. I don't want you showing up in something that screams for attention. You're there to be a backdrop, Elle. Don't try too hard. You'll only embarrass me if you look like you're trying to compete with the younger women who will be there." The cruelty was so casual, so practiced, that it barely stung anymore. It was just another data point in the long ledger of his betrayal. I took the dress from him, the cheap polyester feeling cold and scratchy against my palms. "If that's what you want," I said softly. The car ride to the restaurant was a masterclass in sensory discomfort. Mark insisted on driving his silver Porsche, a car that was technically leased through the firm I now owned. The interior was a claustrophobic cage of black leather and the suffocating scent of his cologne, something heavy with sandalwood and ambition that seemed to coat the back of my throat. He drove with a reckless confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other constantly adjusting his cuffs or checking his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't speak to me. He hummed a tune I didn't recognize, his thumb tapping a rhythmic, hungry beat against the steering wheel. Every time we hit a red light, he would pull out his phone, his face illuminating in the dark cabin as he scrolled through messages. I caught a glimpse of a notification, a string of heart emojis next to a name I recognized from his payroll. He didn't even bother to hide it. To him, I was already a ghost, a social obligation he was forced to fulfill one last time before he ascended to the heights he felt he deserved. I sat in the passenger seat, the dusty rose dress bunching uncomfortably at my waist, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon. I looked at my reflection in the window, a woman who looked tired, dated, and entirely unremarkable. I looked exactly like the person Mark wanted the world to see, a woman he had outgrown. He had no idea that beneath the pilled polyester, my heart was beating with the steady, rhythmic countdown of a ticking clock. He was driving us toward a celebration, but by the time the dessert menus were handed out, he would realize he had been driving himself toward a cliff. The valet took the keys with a practiced, deferential nod that Mark soaked up like a sponge, straightening his lapels and checking the set of his jaw in the reflection of the glass doors as if he were entering a coronation rather than a dinner. As we stepped through the heavy bronze doors of the restaurant, the air changed. Gone was the humid, exhaust-heavy breath of the city, replaced by a climate-controlled stillness scented with expensive lilies and the faint, metallic tang of chilled champagne. My heels, older and slightly worn at the taps, made a duller, more hollow sound on the polished marble than I would have liked, but I kept my chin parallel to the floor. I felt the gaze of the hostess, a woman in her early 20s with skin like porcelain and a dress that cost more than my first mortgage, flicker over my faded floral wrap dress. She didn't offer a warm smile. She offered a polite, professional mask that barely hid her confusion as to why a man in a bespoke Italian suit was escorting a woman who looked like she'd been plucked from a bargain bin at a suburban thrift store. Mark didn't notice, or perhaps he did and found it satisfying. He was already scanning the room, his eyes bright with the fever of the hunt, his posture radiating the kind of unearned confidence that usually precedes a spectacular fall. There, he said, his voice dropping an octave into a register of performative authority. He didn't wait for me. He didn't offer his arm or even look back to see if I was keeping pace. He strode toward a semicircular booth in the far corner, a prime piece of real estate that offered both calculated privacy and a commanding view of the entrance. Seated, there was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of cold, expensive light. Sarah. I knew her name from the payroll audits, but seeing her in the flesh was a different kind of assault on the senses. She couldn't have been more than 28, her hair a sleek obsidian bob that framed a face of sharp angles and high porcelain cheekbones. She was wearing a silk slip dressed the color of spilled red wine, the fabric clinging to her frame in a way that made my pilled polyester floral feel like a heavy, suffocating shroud. As we approached, she didn't stand. She didn't even lean forward in a gesture of greeting. She simply watched us, her eyes, a startling, icy blue, hooking into mine with a predatory stillness. There was no flicker of the other woman's guilt in her expression, no hint of shame for the life she was helping to dismantle. Instead, there was a terrifyingly clear sense of ownership. She looked at me the way an apex predator looks at a wounded animal, not with malice, but with the simple, objective knowledge that I was the past and she was the inevitable, shining future. Mark reached the table first. He didn't pull out the chair for me. He didn't even acknowledge the empty space to his left where I was meant to sit. Instead, his hand went straight to the back of Sarah's chair, his fingers grazing the delicate silk of her dress, his thumb tracing a slow, rhythmic circle on the dark wood just inches from her bare shoulder. It was a gesture of such blatant, casual intimacy that it felt like a physical blow to my chest, a public branding that told everyone in the room exactly where his loyalties lay. They didn't speak, but a charge passed between them, a silent dialogue of smirks and shared secrets that left me standing in the aisle like a piece of forgotten luggage. Sarah, this is Elainer, Mark said, his voice breezy and dismissive, as if he were introducing a distant cousin he'd been forced to invite. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were flat, devoid of the warmth he'd once shown me. Sarah is the lead consultant on the restructuring project at the firm. She's been indispensable these last few months. I can imagine, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected, a low, resonant tone that seemed to surprise both of them. In that moment, the internal shift I had felt in the car finalized. The dull throb of the grieving wife, the woman who had spent the last hour feeling humiliated by a dress and a husband's cruelty, began to crystallize into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. I stopped looking at them as my husband and his mistress. I started looking at them as assets and liabilities. I watched the way Sarah's eyes flickered to my outdated, puffed sleeves, the tiny, triumphant curl of her lip as she took in my lack of jewelry. She thought she was seeing my weakness. She thought she was witnessing the final stages of my obsolescence. She had no idea she was looking at the woman who had spent her afternoon signing the very documents that would decide whether Sarah had a job by Monday morning. I sat down, not waiting for Mark to remember his manners. I smoothed the scratchy fabric of my dress over my knees, my movements deliberate and calm. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in the pit of my stomach, but it was being overlaid by a sharp, clinical curiosity. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to see exactly how much rope Mark would braid for his own noose. It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman behind the man, Sarah said, her voice a low, honeyed rasp that held a mocking edge. She reached across the table, not to shake my hand, but to toy with the stem of her wine glass, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the crystal like a countdown. Mark speaks of you often. He says you're very traditional, a real pillar of the home. The word traditional hung in the air between us, a polite euphemism for irrelevant. I met her gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to offer the submissive smile she expected. Mark has always had a very specific way of categorizing the world, I replied, a small, tight smile touching my lips. But the world is changing quite rapidly these days, wouldn't you agree? Especially in the corporate sector. Some people find it very difficult to keep up with who is actually in charge of the narrative. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes then, not fear, not yet, but a momentary lapse in her confidence, a ripple in the smooth surface of her arrogance. Mark, oblivious to the razor-thin subtext of our exchange, laughed and signaled the waiter with an entitled snap of his fingers. He was so convinced of his own assent, so blinded by the reflection of his own ego in Sarah's eyes, that he couldn't hear the ice cracking beneath his feet. He leaned in closer to her, their shoulders almost touching, leaving me on the periphery of a circle he thought he had drawn. I wasn't the wife tonight. I was the silent architect of his ruin, and I was going to enjoy watching him realize who was actually haunting the feast. The waiter arrived with the precision of a clockwork toy, bearing a tray of appetizers that looked more like modern art than food. He set down a plate of beef carpaccio, sliced so thin it was translucent, and a small arrangement of seared scallops nestled in a bed of pea puree. As the young man leaned over to place the silver before me, Mark didn't even pause for breath. He didn't offer a polite thank you or a momentary silence. Instead, he saw the audience, the waiter, the neighboring tables, and most importantly, Sarah, and he leaned into the performance of my humiliation. You have to forgive Elainer, Mark said, his voice carrying just a bit too far, ensuring the waiter heard every syllable. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his fork as if he were pointing out a smudge on a window. She's never quite grasped the concept of professional momentum. For 20 years, I've tried to encourage her to find a passion, a career, something to give her life a bit of texture. But some people are just content to drift. They're the anchors, Sarah. Not the kind that keep you safe, but the kind that keep the ship from actually going anywhere. I felt the heat rise in my neck, a familiar, stinging flush that I usually fought to hide. I focused on the carpaccio, the deep red of the meat mimicking the pulse thrumming in my ears. Sarah let out a soft, melodic giggle, the sound of a woman who had been told she was the wind in the sails. "Oh, Mark, don't be so harsh," she said, though her eyes were dancing with a cruel light. Not everyone is cut out for the high-pressure world we live in. Some people prefer the quiet life. The quiet life is one thing, Mark countered, his tone sharpening into a serrated edge. Laziness is another. It's a lack of intellectual curiosity, really. I've spent the better part of our marriage trying to bridge the gap, trying to explain the complexities of the market or the nuances of the firm's growth, but it's like speaking a foreign language to her. She'd much rather spend her days and my hard-earned money on the most trivial, mind-numbing nonsense you can imagine. Gardening clubs, local historical societies, expensive pottery classes she never finishes. It's a black hole of resources, both financial and emotional. He looked directly at the waiter then, who was hovering awkwardly, waiting for a chance to refill the water glasses. "See that?" Mark pointed to the puffed sleeves of my dress. "A vintage find," she called it. "I call it a waste of $500 that could have been invested in something with an actual return. But that's the reality of being married to a woman with no ambition. You become a benefactor for a life of perpetual leisure." The sting was sharp and specific, a needle-thin prick to the center of my dignity. He wasn't just lying. He was rewriting our history to make himself the long-suffering hero of a tragedy. He was using my supposed simplicity as a canvas to paint Sarah as the vibrant, sophisticated intellectual he deserved. He wanted the waiter to pity him. He wanted Sarah to adore him for his patience. I picked up my fork, the cool silver feeling heavy and solid in my hand. I didn't look up, but I could feel his gaze on the top of my head, heavy with the weight of his contempt. He thought he was dismantling me, piece by piece, stripping away my worth until there was nothing left but the traditional shell he had described. He had no idea that every word he spoke was being recorded in a different ledger now. He thought he was talking to a housewife who didn't understand the market. He didn't realize he was talking to the majority shareholder who was currently calculating the exact cost of his severance package. "The Carpaccio is excellent, Mark," I said softly, finally looking up and meeting his eyes. My voice didn't tremble. It was as smooth and cold as the marble floor beneath us, though I think you're confusing ambition with visibility. Some of the most powerful moves in any market are the ones you never see coming until the ink is already dry. Wouldn't you agree, Sarah? As a consultant, surely you know that the real power often lies with the person who says the least. For a second, the table went silent. The waiter took the opportunity to beat a hasty retreat. Mark's brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at my refusal to play the victim. He opened his mouth to deliver another blow, but I just took a delicate bite of the beef, the iron-rich flavor grounding me. I was no longer his anchor. I was the storm he hadn't checked the radar for. Sarah leaned in, a patronizing smile stretching her lips until they were thin and pale, the color of a winter peach. She reached across the table, her fingers, manicured to a lethal, almond-shaped point, hovering just inches from the puffed sleeve of my vintage dress. She didn't touch it, as if the fabric itself might be contagious, but the gesture was enough to draw a boundary between her tailored, razor-sharp blazer and my softer, more storied silhouette. "You know, honey," she began, her voice dropping into that melodic, sing-song tone one uses when explaining the concept of gravity to a particularly slow toddler. "It's actually quite brave of you to wear something so experimental. But in the professional circles Mark moves in, there's a certain grammar to how we present ourselves. It's about signaling competence before you even open your mouth." She tilted her head, her blonde bob swinging in a perfect, expensive arc. "If you ever want to update your look, I have a wonderful stylist. Someone who understands that a woman's wardrobe should be an investment, not a collection of curiosities. It's all about structure, dear. Without structure, people tend to assume there's nothing of substance underneath." Mark's laugh was a sharp, barking sound that cut through the low hum of the restaurant, a sound I had once found comforting and now found utterly grotesque. He reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a public display of intimacy that was meant to be a blade in my side. "You're too kind, Sarah. I've been telling her for years that the eccentric librarian look doesn't exactly scream power couple. But I suppose when your biggest decision of the day is whether to plant peonies or hydrangeas, you lose the ability to see yourself through a more rigorous lens." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let my hand drop beneath the edge of the table. The linen was heavy, a thick cream-colored damask that felt cool and slightly waxy against my palm. I gripped it, my fingers digging into the intricate weave, feeling the resistance of the high-thread count fabric. It was a grounding sensation, a physical tether to the reality they were so blissfully unaware of. I could feel the individual threads, the starch that gave the cloth its stiff, formal body. As I squeezed, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over me, a sensation like a sudden drop in temperature that makes every detail of the landscape pop into sharp, unforgiving relief. I wasn't angry anymore. I was observant. "It's about the optics, isn't it?" Sarah continued, emboldened by my silence. She took a small, delicate sip of her Sansera, her eyes never leaving mine. "The Sterling Vance merger we're celebrating tonight, it required a very specific kind of aesthetic, sharp, unsentimental. If I had walked into that boardroom looking like I was headed to a tea party, the deal would have folded in 10 minutes. Men like the board members at Aegis, they respect a woman who looks like she can handle a balance sheet as well as she handles a boardroom. It's a language you have to learn to speak, or you'll always be an outsider looking in." Mark beamed at her, his chest swelling with a reflected glory that made my stomach turn. "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to explain." Sarah was instrumental in the final push. Her firm's consultation on the cultural alignment of the merger was the icing on the cake. While some people were at home worrying about the pH of their soil, we were in the trenches making history. They shared a look then, a private, smug communion that excluded me entirely. They laughed, a soft, conspiratorial sound, at the expense of the woman they thought was a ghost at her own table. They had no idea that the cultural alignment Sarah had been hired for was a redundant line item I had approved merely to see how much rope she would take before she hung herself. They didn't realize that the trenches they spoke of were actually a playground I had designed, and that every move they made had been choreographed by the very person they were currently treating as a decorative afterthought. I watched the way the candlelight flickered in the depths of Sarah's eyes, noting the way she preened under Mark's gaze. She thought she was the architect of his new life. He thought he was the master of his own destiny. And I, gripping the linen until my knuckles turned white, knew that the ink on the final merger documents, the ones that listed me as the majority shareholder of the acquiring firm, was already dry. I wasn't the anchor. I was the tide, and they were about to realize just how far out to sea they had drifted. The waiter arrived with our main courses, a choreographed interruption that momentarily suspended the tension. He moved with the silent efficiency of a well-oiled machine, placing the Dover sole in front of me with a practiced flourish. The aroma of lemon, browned butter, and briny capers rose in a delicate cloud, a scent that should have been appetizing but instead felt like a mockery of the domesticity I was about to lose, or rather, the domesticity I was about to shed. The fish was pale and perfectly flaked, swimming in a pool of golden Beurre Blanc that shimmered under the low, amber light of the chandelier. Mark didn't even look at his steak. As soon as the waiter's footsteps faded into the ambient hum of the dining room, he reached into the leather briefcase he'd tucked beside his chair. The sound of the zipper was a sharp, metallic rasp, a violent intrusion into the refined atmosphere. He pulled out a manila envelope, its corners crisp and uncreased, and slid it across the cream-colored damask. It glided over the fabric, coming to rest precisely between my wine glass and my untouched plate. "I think it's best if we don't drag this out," Mark said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced authority. It was his boardroom voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound decisive and unimpeachable. "I've had my lawyers draw these up. It's a generous settlement, all things considered. I want you to be taken care of course, but I also need to move forward without any lingering entanglements." Sarah leaned forward, her elbows on the table in a breach of etiquette that she clearly felt her new status excused. "It's for the best, really. Mark is entering a completely different sphere now. The demands of a C-suite position at a firm like Aegis Global are extraordinary. He needs a partner who can keep pace, someone who understands the stakes of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate." Mark nodded, his eyes bright with a feverish kind of ambition. "I've just signed the offer letter, Aliner, Executive Vice President of Global Operations. The base salary alone is 2.4 million, not including the performance bonuses and the stock options. It's the kind of role people spend 30 years chasing, and I've landed it at 45. We're moving to a penthouse in the city. Sarah has already found a place that fits the image we need to project." He looked at me then, searching for the crack in my facade, the first sign of the tears or the pleading he clearly expected. He wanted the satisfaction of my devastation. He wanted to see me crumble so he could feel even more powerful in his ascent. He wanted to play the role of the benevolent victor, granting a pittance to the discarded wife. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I didn't even blink. Instead, I reached into my small, structured clutch, a vintage piece of black lizard skin that felt cool and pebbled beneath my fingertips, and pulled out my pen. It was a Mont Blanc Meisterstück, weighted perfectly, the gold nib glinting like a needle. I unscrewed the cap with a slow, deliberate twist, the threads of the pen engaging with a satisfying, tactile precision. I pulled the documents toward me. The paper was heavy, a high-grade legal bond that felt cold and stiff. I didn't read the clauses about the house or the alimony. I didn't look at the division of our shared life into columns of assets and liabilities. I simply flipped to the final page where a small, yellow "Sign Here" tab fluttered in the slight draft from the air conditioning. The silence at the table became heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. Mark's confident smirk wavered just for a second as he watched me. He had expected a scene. He had expected me to scream, to throw the wine, to beg him to remember the 20 years we'd spent building a life. He expected the eccentric librarian to be lost without her gardener and her peonies. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. The ink flowed in a smooth, dark ribbon, my signature appearing on the line with a fluid grace. I signed both copies, the scratching of the gold nib against the fibers of the paper, the only sound in our small, suffocating world. When I was finished, I capped the pen with a soft click and slid the papers back toward him. "There," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a deep well. I picked up my fork and took a small, precise bite of the sole. The fish melted on my tongue, the acidity of the lemon cutting through the richness of the butter. "Is the steak to your liking, Mark? I'd hate for such an expensive meal to go to waste on account of your new salary." Sarah blinked, her mouth parting slightly in genuine confusion. This wasn't the script she had written. Mark stared at the signed documents, then at me, his brow furrowing. He looked like a man who had prepared for a war only to find the gates of the city left wide open, the inhabitants gone, and the gold already moved to a different vault. He had the papers, but he had lost the power of the moment. He didn't realize that by signing so easily, I had just handed him a one-way ticket to a destination I already owned. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to see the look of baffled triumph on Mark's face or the predatory glint in Sarah's eyes as she mentally began redecorating a penthouse that didn't yet exist. I simply stood, the silk of my understated dress whispering against the leather of the chair, and walked away. The restaurant, with its dim lighting and the clinking of silver against porcelain, felt suddenly small, like a stage set I had finally outgrown. The air outside was a sharp, bracing contrast to the cloying scent of Sarah's expensive perfume and the suffocating weight of Mark's ego. It was cool, tinged with the metallic scent of impending rain and the distant, rhythmic hum of the city. I handed my ticket to the valet, a young man who barely looked up from his podium, and waited. When my car, a sleek obsidian black Mercedes AMG that I typically kept garaged at a private facility near the district, purred to a stop in front of me, I felt the first real shift. The homely wife persona, the woman who wore sensible cardigans and spent her Tuesdays deadheading peonies, began to dissolve. It was a physical sensation, a literal uncoiling of my spine. I slid into the driver's seat, the Napa leather cool and firm against my back, and gripped the steering wheel. The engine's low, predatory growl was the only music I needed. As I pulled away from the curb, leaving the flickering candlelight of the bistro behind, I reached up and pulled the tortoiseshell pin from my hair. The heavy, dark mass tumbled down my shoulders, a wilder, more honest version of myself reflecting in the rearview mirror. I wiped the neutral, approachable lipstick from my mouth with a silk handkerchief, revealing the hard, determined line of my lips. By the time I reached the interstate, the suburban gardener was gone. In her place sat the woman who had quietly built an empire while her husband was busy playing at being a big fish in a small pond. The drive toward the financial district was a journey through a neon-lit labyrinth. The city skyline rose up to meet me, a jagged crown of glass and light against the bruised purple of the night sky. I didn't head toward the house we shared, the one with the wrap-around porch and the memories of a marriage that had turned to ash. Instead, I navigated toward the heart of the steel and stone canyon where the real power lived. My office sat atop a 60-story monolith of architectural precision, a building that looked like a shard of fallen sky. As I pulled into the private executive garage, the biometric scanner chirped in recognition, the gate sliding open with a silent hydraulic hiss. Walking through the lobby was an exercise in reclaiming my territory. The space was a cathedral of minimalism, white marble floors polished to a mirror shine, soaring glass walls, and a silence so profound it felt expensive. My heels clicked against the stone, a sharp, rhythmic staccato that echoed through the empty atrium. The night security guard, a man who had known me for a decade as the firm's most formidable architect of acquisitions, stood and offered a crisp nod. I didn't stop to chat. I stepped into the private elevator, pressed the button for the penthouse suite, and watched the city drop away through the glass back of the car. My private office was dark when I entered, the only light coming from the sprawling grid of the city below, filtered through floor to ceiling windows. I didn't turn on the overheads. I preferred the shadows, they were more honest. I walked to the mahogany desk, a massive, singular slab of wood that felt like an anchor in the shifting sea of my life, and sat down. The transition was complete. The air here was filtered, pressurized, and smelled faintly of ozone and old money. I reached for the sleek, encrypted handset on my desk and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Arthur," I said, my voice dropping into that register of absolute, unshakable authority that Mark had never heard. It wasn't the voice of a wife, it was the voice of a sovereign. "Eleanor," Arthur's voice came through, crisp and alert despite the hour. "I assumed you'd be calling." "I take it the dinner went as expected." "He signed," I said, looking out at the glittering lights, picking out the building where Aegis Global held its headquarters. "He signed the papers without reading a single word of the fine print. He was too busy telling me about his new role as executive vice president." I heard the faint rustle of paper on the other end of the line. "Then he's in for a very difficult Monday morning. I'm looking at the final confirmation now." The wire transfers cleared at 4:58 p.m. The board of directors at Aegis Global finalized the sale to your holding company at exactly 5:00 p.m. this afternoon. You are now the majority shareholder of the parent corporation. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips. "So, in the eyes of the law and the corporate bylaws, I am his ultimate superior." "Technically," Arthur replied, a hint of dry amusement in his tone, "you are the woman who owns the chair he's planning to sit in. You own his contract, his stock options, and his bonus structure. You are, for all intents and purposes, his new boss. How would you like to proceed with the announcement?" I leaned back, the city lights reflecting in the dark glass of the window like 1,000 tiny fires. Let him have his weekend, Arthur. Let him celebrate his ascent with his mistress. Let him buy the champagne and toast to his new life. I want him to be at the very peak of his arrogance when he walks into that boardroom on Monday morning. I want him to see me sitting at the head of the table before he realizes that the generous settlement he gave me was just the first payment on the debt he's about to owe me. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of the glass and steel fortress I had built. Mark thought he had discarded a relic of his past. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his future to the woman who now owned him, body and soul, in the only currency that ever truly mattered in this city. I wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. I was his reckoning. The morning light crawled across the floorboards of our bedroom, thin and pale, like it was hesitant to witness the final disintegration of a 15-year marriage. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny, frantic particles that seemed more alive than the atmosphere between Mark and me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my back straight, watching him through the reflection in the vanity mirror. Mark didn't just pack, he performed. He was a whirlwind of frantic, joyous energy, a man who believed he was finally shedding a heavy, outdated skin to reveal something shimmering and new. He threw a bundle of silk ties into his Toomey suitcase, the metal hangers clattering against each other with a harsh, discordant ring. "I'll have my assistant send over a list of the furniture I want," he said, his voice airy and thick with a condescending pity that made my skin itch. He didn't look at me. He was too busy admiring the way his reflection looked in his new tailored blazer. "The penthouse is mostly furnished, of course, modern, minimalist, none of this heavy Victorian clutter, but there are a few pieces of art I'd like to keep for the aesthetic." I didn't answer. I reached for the velvet box on my nightstand and pulled out a pair of pearl earrings, the weight of them cool against my palms. I could hear the rhythmic zip, zip, zip of his suitcase, the sound of a man closing chapters he never bothered to read. "You're being very quiet, Alina," he said, finally turning to face me. He leaned against the mahogany dresser, the one we'd bought together in Florence during a summer when we still liked the sound of each other's laughter. He looked at me as if I were a tragic figure in a play he'd already seen too many times. "I know this is hard. I know you're worried about the finances, but I've instructed the lawyers to be generous. You'll be begging for alimony eventually, I'm sure, once the reality of your lifestyle hits your bank account, but I'm willing to help you transition, for old time's sake." A small, sharp smile touched my lips, though I kept it hidden as I leaned forward to check my makeup. "Generous. Thank you, Mark. That's very thoughtful of you." "It's just reality," he shrugged, checking his watch, a gold Rolex he'd bought himself to celebrate the promotion he thought he'd earned on his own merit. "Tiffany is waiting downstairs. We have a brunch with the Aegis board members at 11. It's a big day. First impressions are everything at this level, and frankly, she fits the image better, you understand." He said it so casually, as if he were explaining why he'd chosen a different brand of scotch. I looked past him at the bookshelves, noticing a thin layer of gray dust settled on the spines of our old law texts. The house was already becoming a museum of a life that no longer existed. I stood up and walked toward the closet, my movements deliberate and slow. I didn't head for the floral dresses or the sensible cardigans he expected me to wear. I reached for my armor. The suit was a deep midnight charcoal, crafted from wool so fine it felt like liquid against the skin. I had it commissioned months ago, long before the sale of Aegis Global was even a whisper in the press. The silk lining was the color of dried blood, a secret hidden against my ribs. As I pulled the jacket on, the structured shoulders gave me a silhouette that was sharp, predatory, and entirely unfamiliar to the man standing in my bedroom. "Where are you going?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed the shift in my attire. "Going to see your sister, or maybe a therapist? It might be good for you to talk to someone, Alina, someone professional." "I have an appointment," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor he was listening for. I picked up my briefcase, black calfskin with silver hardware, and checked the time on my own watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to my father. "A very important meeting. I wouldn't want to be late." Mark chuckled, a dry, grating sound. He snapped his suitcase shut and hauled it off the bed. "Right, well, don't let me keep you from your appointment. Just try not to spend all the settlement money in one place, okay? It has to last you a long time." He walked toward the door, his arrogance trailing behind him like a cheap cologne. He had no idea that while he was planning his ascent into a penthouse built on my foundations, I was already standing at the summit, waiting to watch him fall. He didn't know that the generous settlement he'd signed was a drop in the ocean compared to the empire I had consolidated under his very nose. "Goodbye, Mark," I said softly as he reached the hallway. "See you in court, Alina," he called back, his voice echoing with a triumph that was about to turn to ash. I waited until I heard the front door heavy thud shut, followed by the purr of his sports car pulling out of the driveway. Only then did I let out a long, slow breath. I looked at my reflection one last time, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as the majority shareholder of the world he thought he owned. I walked out of the house, leaving the dust and the memories behind, and stepped into the waiting black car that would take me to the boardroom where his execution was scheduled for noon. The car moved through the city like a silent blade, slicing through the morning fog that clung to the glass towers of the financial district. I sat in the back of the obsidian black Maybach, my hands resting atop my briefcase. The leather was pebbled, cool, and carried the weight of 1,000 decisions Mark believed he had made alone. Arthur, my driver for the last 3 years, a man I'd hired through a shell company specifically to keep him out of Mark's orbit, didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply caught my eye in the rearview mirror, a brief flicker of recognition that today was the day the world tilted back onto its proper axis. We bypassed the main entrance where the press and the mid-level managers scurried like ants, their lives dictated by the rise and fall of numbers they didn't truly understand. Instead, the car dipped into the subterranean throat of the Aegis Global headquarters. The private executive garage was a sanctuary of polished concrete and low-voltage amber lighting, a cathedral for the engines of the powerful. As we pulled into the designated spot, the one marked only with a gold leaf one, the engine died with a soft, satisfied sigh. Elias was waiting for me. He was the head of security, a man who had seen 3 CEOs come and go, and a man who knew exactly whose signature appeared at the bottom of his paycheck. He stepped forward as Arthur opened my door, his movements precise and devoid of the casual laziness he showed the junior partners. He didn't just offer a polite nod, he straightened his spine, his hand coming to a crisp, respectful hover near his temple in a half salute. It was the kind of reverence reserved for monarchs or monsters, and in this building I was both. I stepped out, the soles of my shoes hitting the pavement with a sound like a gavel. "Good morning, Madam Chairwoman," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the reinforced walls. "Good morning, Elias. Is everything prepared?" I asked, not stopping as I moved toward the private elevator bank. "The boardroom is secure, and the floors have been swept for any unauthorized devices." The guests for the 11 o'clock brunch have begun to arrive in the main lobby. Your husband and his guest are currently being processed through the standard visitor protocols at the front desk. A small, cold thrill moved through me, sharp as a needle. Mark would be fuming, forced to stand in line, forced to show his identification to a 24-year-old security guard, and forced to wait for a visitor's badge that would clip onto his lapel like a leash. I, meanwhile, would be ascending in the private lift that required a biometric scan he didn't even know existed. "Excellent," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk lining of my jacket. "Ensure they are comfortable. I wouldn't want them to be anything less than perfectly relaxed before the meeting begins. Perhaps offer them the premium sparkling water, the one Mark likes to pretend he can identify by taste." I turned toward the executive elevator, the brushed steel doors reflecting a woman Mark wouldn't recognize. This woman didn't apologize for the space she occupied. I felt the weight of the briefcase in my right hand. It was heavy, filled with the notarized transfers of power, the forensic audits of his discretionary spending, and the legal documents that would strip him of every vanity he possessed. It was a physical anchor, grounding me as I stepped into the lift and pressed the button for the 60th floor. The ascent was silent. No music, no vibration, just the subtle, rhythmic pressure in my inner ear as the floors blurred past. When the doors slid open on the top floor, the hush was absolute. This was the inner sanctum, a place of floor-to-ceiling glass, chrome accents, and silence so thick you could almost hear the interest accruing on the company's global accounts. The air here smelled of expensive ozone and filtered success. My heels began their steady rhythm on the white Italian marble floor. Clack, clack, clack. It was a predatory beat, a countdown. I thought back to the dinner the night before, how I had sat there across from him and Tiffany, making myself small, letting the light catch the sensible pearls Mark had bought me years ago to mark a decade of my support. I remembered the way Tiffany had looked at me with that pitying, youthful sneer. her eyes tracing my face as if looking for the cracks where my age showed, treating me like a piece of outdated furniture he was finally getting around to replacing. I had played the part of the shrinking Violet so well that I had almost started to believe the performance myself. But as the marble stretched out before me, leading toward the double mahogany doors of the chairperson's suite, that shadow of a woman vanished. Every step was a reclamation of the person I had been before I allowed his ego to become my primary occupation. Every sound of my heel was a strike against the arrogance of the man who thought he had outsmarted a ghost. I wasn't just arriving at my office. I was walking onto a battlefield I had already terraformed to my advantage. I reached the doors, and the two assistants standing guard there didn't ask for my name. They simply bowed their heads and pulled the handles wide, ushering me into the silence of my own empire. I walked across the vast expanse of my office, the air-conditioned chill a stark contrast to the humid morning outside. The suite was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, designed to make anyone who entered feel small. Yet for the first time in years, I felt as though I finally fit the scale of the room. I didn't sit behind the massive desk of polished obsidian. Instead, I moved toward the far wall, where a seamless panel of mahogany slid back at the touch of a hidden sensor. Behind it lay the observation gallery, a narrow, darkened corridor that overlooked the primary orientation boardroom. The glass was one way, a high-tech shroud that allowed me to witness the theater of my own company without becoming a part of the performance. I stepped into the shadows, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of my heels, and looked down into the room where my future and Mark's past was about to collide. There he was. Mark sat at the head of a smaller satellite table, surrounded by three other men who had been recruited for the new executive tier. He looked exactly as he always did when he thought he was the most important person in the room. He had his chest puffed out, his shoulders broad and stiff in a charcoal suit that I had personally commissioned from a tailor on Savile Row last Christmas. He was leaning back, one arm draped over the back of his chair in a gesture of practiced nonchalant dominance. The smug grin on his face was one I knew intimately. It was the look he wore when he'd successfully gaslit me into believing I was the one who had forgotten an anniversary, or the look he gave the mirror before we left for a gala where he intended to network on the back of my reputation. Beside him, the other three executives, men with impressive resumes and nervous eyes, seemed to be hanging on his every word. Mark was holding court, his voice muffled by the glass but piped into the gallery through a discreet speaker system. He was mid-anecdote, his hands moving in wide, expansive gestures. The key to this level of the game, Mark was saying, his voice dripping with a condescending brand of mentor energy, is knowing when to trim the fat. You can't carry baggage into a role like this. I spent years dragging around dead weight, thinking loyalty was a virtue, but as soon as this opportunity landed, I cleared the deck. You have to be lean to run with the big dogs. One of the younger men, a slim man in a navy blazer who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, nodded eagerly. You mean personal life balance? Mark chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. I mean liabilities. My ex-wife, well, she will be soon, bless her heart. She was a lovely woman in the beginning, but she was a relic of a different version of me. A supportive anchor that eventually just became an anchor. To get to this office, to stand in this building, I had to cut the line. You'll find that once you're at the top, the view is much better without someone constantly reminding you of where you started. He leaned forward then, his eyes bright with a predatory sort of ambition. He checked his gold watch, another gift from me, and glanced toward the double doors at the front of the orientation room. The new owner is supposed to be a shark, Mark continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphones picked up with crystalline clarity. Word is she bought out the previous board in a silent coup that took less than a week. That's the kind of energy I respect. That's the kind of woman who will appreciate a man who knows how to prioritize success over sentimentality. I watched him through the glass, my breath steady, my heart a calm, rhythmic pulse. He was so certain. He was so incredibly sure that the world was designed to reward his specific brand of cruelty. He thought he was waiting for a stranger, a cold-blooded titan of industry who would look at his betrayal of his wife and see a kindred spirit. He had no idea that the dead weight he had so casually discarded was currently standing 6 feet away, shrouded in shadows, holding the keys to his entire existence. I watched the way his fingers drummed on the table, the way he adjusted his tie, the way he checked his reflection in the very glass I was standing behind. He was preening for me, and he didn't even know it. The silence in the gallery was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound of his world breaking. I waited for the precise moment when the HR director would enter to announce my arrival, savoring the sight of his arrogance before I stepped out to dismantle it. I emerged from the shadows of the gallery, the transition from the dim, carpeted silence of the observation deck to the brightly lit, clinical perfection of the executive hallway feeling like a rebirth. Each step was a deliberate strike against the floor, a rhythmic ticking of a clock that Mark didn't know was counting down to zero. I could feel the adrenaline not as a flutter of anxiety, but as a cold, stabilizing force that sharpened my senses. I reached the double doors of the boardroom where Sarah, the director of human resources, stood waiting. She offered a small, knowing nod, her eyes reflecting a mixture of professional deference and a flicker of something that looked like justice. She reached for the heavy brass handles, and with a synchronized heavy pull, the world of Mark's making was torn open. The room was a vacuum of silence for a heartbeat as I stepped over the threshold. Mark was still positioned exactly as I had seen him through the glass, arrogant, sprawling, the self-appointed king of a hill that was actually a sandcastle. He was mid-sentence, his mouth open to finish some final derogatory flourish about dead weight and clearing the deck, but the words died in his throat, turning into a dry, choked rasp. The physical transformation was instantaneous and visceral. The healthy, sun-kissed glow he'd maintained through months of deceit and business trips vanished, replaced by a pallor so sudden and profound it looked like a shroud. His jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to unhinge, his mouth hanging in a silent, pathetic O that stripped away every ounce of the masculine dominance he had been projecting. I watched the way his eyes dilated, the pupils swallowing the blue as he struggled to reconcile the wife he had just mocked with the woman standing at the head of the room. His hands, which had been gesturing so expansively moments ago, now clutched the edge of the mahogany table, and I could see the unmistakable, frantic vibration of his fingers against the wood. He looked like a man watching his own execution. To his left sat Alina, the woman he had brought in as a strategic consultant, the very person he had been flaunting on his arm at the clubs he thought I didn't know about, the woman he had promised a corner office in this new empire. She looked from him to me, her own expression shifting from confused annoyance to a dawning, horrific realization. She looked small in her chair, the bravado she had shared with Mark evaporating like mist in the sun. She tried to sit up straighter, to regain some semblance of the power player persona she had adopted, but her eyes kept darting toward the door, looking for an exit that didn't exist. I didn't look at Mark. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a shared glance or even a spark of domestic recognition. To me, in this room, he was not the man who had shared my bed or broken my trust. He was merely a line item on a balance sheet that was about to be balanced. I walked to the head of the table, my movements fluid and unhurried, the silk of my suit whispering against the quiet of the room. I set my leather portfolio down on the surface with a soft, authoritative thud that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that felt like a razor's edge. I turned my gaze to the room at large, sweeping past Mark as if he were part of the office furniture, an unremarkable fixture in a room I now owned. I am the new owner of this firm. My name is Catherine Vance, and as of 8 o'clock this morning, the direction, the culture, and the leadership of this company have shifted irrevocably. I leaned forward slightly, resting my palms on the cool, polished surface of the table, commanding the space with a stillness that Mark could never emulate. We are here to discuss the future. My vision for this organization is not one of trimming fat or cutting lines for the sake of ego. It is a vision built on the bedrock of radical transparency and unwavering ethical standards. I have spent the last few months observing the culture of this office from a distance, and what I have seen is a pervasive rot, a delusional belief that personal ruthlessness and the betrayal of one's foundations equate to professional prowess. I finally let my eyes rest on Mark, though I kept my expression a mask of cool, professional detachment, as if I were examining a flawed prototype. "In my company, the way you treat those you deem beneath you or those who have supported your ascent is the only metric of your character. If you are a person who views loyalty as a liability, or who treats the very people who built your platform as dead weight to be discarded when a shinier object appears, then you are fundamentally incompatible with the leadership I require. Here, integrity is not a suggestion, it is the currency of your employment. We will be reviewing every contract, every promotion, and every consultant brought into this fold with a microscope. If the foundation is found wanting, the structure will be demolished." Mark's face was now a map of pure, unadulterated terror, a single bead of sweat tracing a slow, jagged path down his temple. He tried to speak, his throat working convulsively, but no sound came out. I turned back to the rest of the room, my smile thin and devoid of warmth, the silence in the room so heavy it felt like it could shatter the glass walls. "Now, shall we begin the audit?" The audit was a slow, methodical flaying. For nearly an hour, I sat at the head of that mahogany table and took apart every strategic initiative Mark had spent months building. I didn't raise my voice once. I simply pointed out the redundancies, the inflated projections, and the blatant favoritism embedded in his hiring choices. I watched as the board members, men who had laughed at his jokes and played golf with him just days prior, began to lean away from him, their bodies instinctively distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Alina sat beside him, her face a pale mask of terror, her hand twitching toward her designer bag as if she were ready to bolt at the first opportunity. When I finally dismissed the room, the air felt thick with the scent of ozone and ruined ambition. I didn't look at Alina as she scurried out, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the marble floor. I only looked at Mark. "In my office," I said, my voice as cold as the glass walls surrounding us. Now, I walked ahead of him, the heels of my pumps striking the floor with a rhythmic, predatory precision. My new office was a sanctuary of steel and charcoal velvet, a space that felt entirely disconnected from the domestic life we had shared. I sat behind the expansive desk, the weight of the leather chair supporting me, and waited. Mark entered like a man walking toward a gallows. He didn't sit. He hovered near the door, his hand gripping the back of one of the guest chairs so hard his knuckles were white. The alpha persona he had cultivated so carefully had completely collapsed. His shoulders were hunched, and his tie, which he usually wore with such arrogance, looked like a noose. Catherine, he started, his voice cracking on the first syllable. He cleared his throat, trying to find that resonant, persuasive tone he used to manipulate me. Catherine, look, I had no idea. If I had known it was you behind the acquisition, I would have reached out. We can fix this. We're a team, right? Think of what we can do with your capital and my knowledge of this firm's inner workings. We can renegotiate my contract, make it a partnership. For the sake of everything we've built together at home, we should keep this professional and professional, I interrupted, the word coming out as a sharp, dry laugh. I leaned back, crossing my legs, the silk of my skirt rustling in the silence. You want to talk about what we've built at home, Mark? Or shall we talk about the consultant you just tried to install in the office next to yours, the one you've been spending my dividends on at the St. Regis? He flinched as if I'd struck him. That was a mistake, a temporary lapse. I was under so much pressure and I felt like you were drifting away. I was trying to secure our future. You were trying to secure a future that didn't include me, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a slim navy blue folder. I slid it across the polished surface toward him. It stopped exactly at the edge of the desk. Open it. With trembling fingers, he opened the folder. I watched his eyes scan the documents, his breath hitching as he realized what he was looking at. It wasn't a promotion or a partnership agreement. It was a formal termination of employment, effective immediately. Conflict of interest, I stated, ticking the points off on my fingers. Failure of fiduciary duty, and most importantly, a fundamental failure of character. You used company resources to facilitate your personal indiscretions, and you attempted to hire an unqualified individual based on a personal relationship. In this firm, that is a terminal offense. There is no severance, there is no renegotiation, there is only the exit. You can't do this, he whispered, his eyes wide and bloodshot. I built this department. You're destroying my career over a domestic dispute. I'm not destroying your career, Mark. I'm simply holding you accountable to the standards you claim to uphold. You told me once that the world belongs to those who are ruthless enough to take it. I suppose I finally took your advice. I stood up then, the movement fluid and final. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I felt a vast, cool clarity. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Your personal belongings will be couriered to your mother's house by the end of the day. Do not return to our home. The locks have already been changed, and the property is held in a trust you no longer have access to. He tried to speak again, his mouth working like a landed fish, but the words died in his throat. He looked small, physically diminished, as if the very air had been sucked out of his lungs. He turned without another word and walked out, his gait heavy and uneven. I didn't follow him. Instead, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling parking lot and the city skyline beyond. I stood there for a long time, my hands resting lightly on the cool glass. From this height, the world looked organized, manageable, and full of potential. I watched the tiny figure of Mark emerge from the glass doors of the lobby. He looked lost, standing on the sidewalk for a moment as if he couldn't remember where he had parked his car, the car I had paid for. He looked like a stranger, a ghost of a life I had outgrown. I watched him finally reach his vehicle, his movements sluggish and defeated, and drive away into the midday traffic. I didn't feel a pang of regret. I didn't feel the hollow ache of a broken heart. I felt the weight of the building beneath my feet, the hum of the computers, the collective energy of hundreds of employees who were now under my protection. I took a deep, steady breath, the scent of expensive lilies on my desk filling my lungs. For years, I had been the silent architect of his success, the foundation he thought he could kick away without the structure collapsing. He was wrong. I wasn't just the foundation, I was the entire skyline. I turned away from the window, sat back down at my desk, and opened the next file. My work was only just beginning.